Welcome to the Veterans History Project interview. I'm your host, Kevin Riotto, and with us today is Lieutenant Colonel Mike Hendrickson. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And in what war and what branch were you a part of?
So I served in the United States Marine Corps. I served from 1993 until the present time. I'm in the reserves still. So the majority of my time in service has been during the global war on terror. Specifically, the operations that I've taken place, that I've participated in, were during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan.
Okay. And what made you choose the Marine Corps?
Well, that's actually kind of an interesting story. I went to all the recruiters. I'm from State College, Pennsylvania, so I went to all the recruiters in town before I decided to come to Penn State. Except for the Marine Corps recruiter. And I just wasn't interested in the other branches of the service. The recruiters in those other branches kind of turned me off. Mm-hmm. And then after about 2 years at Penn State, when I had a 1.9 GPA, I had a lot of fun my first 2 years at Penn State. I decided, literally standing in the shower in my fraternity house one morning, that I would, instead of going to class, I would go see the Marine Corps recruiter. And I walked in and they basically said, well, sure, you can join the Marine Corps if we want you to. So it was, they kind of threw down the gauntlet, and I was like, well, I'm definitely going to join now because you said I can't, you know. So that's what I did. I spent my first 2 years between, I took that time off from Penn State, so I took a leave of absence. And then I went to boot camp in 1993 at Parris Island. And then in the spring of 94, went to the School of Infantry down in Jacksonville, North Carolina, Camp Lejeune, as some people like to call it. And then I came back to Penn State, intending to come back to school in the fall of 1994, and we got activated and sent to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. It was during the Haitian and Cuban migration crisis in 1994. So I spent some time there. So my first probably 18 months in the Marine Corps Reserve was on active duty between boot camp, going to the School of Infantry, and then that first deployment. Okay.
And what was your highest rank that you achieved?
So I'm a lieutenant colonel now, so that's my highest rank.
Highest rank.
But when I was on the enlisted side before I was commissioned, I was a corporal and selected for meritorious promotion to sergeant, but then I was accepted to officer candidate school. So instead of getting that promotion, I went down to Quantico, Virginia for 10 weeks to go through OCS.
Okay. And how long did you serve? I know you said you're still in the reserves now, but when you were in active service, how long did you serve, and where were you serving during this time?
I was, in 1998, I went to officer candidate school in October. Right. I was commissioned December 12th, 1998. And so I spent roughly 10 months in Quantico, Virginia, between officer candidate school, the basic school, which is the school that all Marine officers go through after they finish either OCS, Service Academy, or ROTC. And then I became an infantry officer, and I went to the infantry officer course in Quantico, and then I went out to Camp Pendleton, California. Spent a bunch of time there, came back to the East Coast. So I spent time all over the Marine Corps, between East Coast and West Coast. And I was on active duty for about 10 years. Okay.
And can you recall your first days in the service?
Well, yes. The day that I reported to boot camp was probably one of the most memorable days of my service in the Marine Corps. What happens is, you go, show up, your recruiter takes you, drops you off, you get on a plane. For those Marines that are east of the Mississippi, you go to Parris Island. For those that are west, they go to Camp Pendleton. And those of us that go to Parris Island lovingly refer to the Marines that go to the West Coast as Hollywood Marines because it's California, and we went to the real boot camp, which is Parris Island. So anyway, you fly into Charlotte, and that's where you get picked up to take the bus to Parris Island, and it's designed to be for you to arrive at like 2 a.m. So I think the one thing that I remember vividly, and I recall it like it was yesterday, is there's a causeway that you drive in, and there's a gate at the front of the causeway, and then you cross the causeway into Parris Island, and then you go to receiving, and that's where the drill instructors first show up. But at that gate, the bus stops. They check the driver, and I looked at that sign. There's a big red sign that's out in front of the gate, and it says MCRD, Marine Recruiting Depot, Parris Island, South Carolina. And I looked at that sign, and I thought to myself that if there were one of two ways that I was going to see that sign again, I was either I don't know why I'm getting so emotional talking about this, but
take your time.
I was either going to be a Marine or was going to go home not being a Marine. And it's just quite an experience, and the change in a person that occurs, going through that place, and I'm sure it's like that for other people that go through other branches of the service, but for me, becoming a Marine was a complete life-changing event.
Yeah.
And it led to a lot of other things. Obviously, 23 years in the Marine Corps, it led to a whole different life than I would have had if I hadn't become a Marine and saw that sign in a different way when I left. So I mean, that was I won't ever forget that feeling. And I think for a lot of Marines that have gone through Parris Island or wherever else and earned the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, it's especially Parris Island and also MCRD San Diego. I'm sure just as much, even though it's Hollywood. There is most people will talk about like when they got off the bus or when the drill instructor gets on the bus and it's deathly quiet on that bus, and this guy pops up with his campaign cover on, and in this this voice that is remarkable. You never forget kind of the voice of the drill instructors. They all sound the same, but it's this commanding voice that you've never been exposed to before. And the guy gets up, stands there, and he tells you exactly what you're going to do when you get up and leave the bus. You get off the bus, there's yellow footprints that you fall in on, and then you go through the process of them processing you into the Marine Corps. So you get your head shaved and all that stuff. And I mean, I think there's a lot of Marines that talk about those things. I've never met a Marine who has talked about that sign. I don't know why. It was so just left such an indelible mark on my experience as a Marine. I don't know why.
Yeah, some things just stick with you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, can you tell us about your training experience at Parris Island?
Well, so when I went through, it was 13 weeks. I'm not sure what it is now. It's probably pretty similar. They've changed the recruit training a little bit since I was there. If you interview other Marines that are younger than me, they probably would have gone through what was called the Crucible. So it's the culminating event at the end. I went through a 3-phase system where the first phase was basically it's a lot of physical fitness, a lot of getting yelled at, do the right things, a lot of visits to, what they call the pit, which is basically a big sandbox filled with sand fleas. And so whenever anybody messes up, usually the entire platoon is going to go to the pit and they just PTU until you're dead. So it's that part's not a lot of fun, but you learn a lot of things about how to work well within a group, and also how not to piss off the rest of your platoon mates, because if you're that guy who's always getting everybody else in trouble, it can become very similar to what happened to Private Pyle in Full Metal Jacket, although we didn't have anybody get any blanket parties or anything like that. But
No.
that's not out of the realm of what has happened before in the Marine Corps. We try not to haze anybody anymore. It's a big deal when that happens, but in the past, that's been something that has happened.
Yeah.
But so that's first phase, a lot of marching, like learning how to do close order drill. And then second phase, you go to the rifle range. So you really learn the bread and butter of what it means to be a Marine, which is marksmanship. I mean, we always talk about how well Marines shoot. And every Marine is taught to be a rifleman first. The philosophy is that, and this is borne out from history, from the Marine Corps from the very beginning, is that any Marine anywhere in the world that's in combat or close to combat could find themselves in combat at any point, whether you're a truck driver, an airplane mechanic. At any point you could be required to employ your personal weapon, your rifle. And I mean that has borne out during World War II, during the Korean War especially, and in Vietnam as well, and more so in the modern fight because the asymmetrical nature of what we do in combat now, and how we fight with distributed operations and really no front lines, and it's a very important concept. So you go to the rifle range, you qualify. If you don't qualify, you go back to first phase, and then you also go through some field firing, so you learn how to employ not only just in a static position to employ your rifle, but also in a more dynamic environment, which is more akin to what you would find in combat on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And then third phase is really that's where you learn, I think principally it becomes important to learn at that point how the Marine Corps functions and what your role is within the Marine Corps. That's when everybody finds out what their military occupational specialty is going to be. So whether you're going to be an infantryman or a tanker, or you're going to be an airplane mechanic or whatever it is,
right.
That's when everybody finds out, usually towards the end of third phase, and then you graduate after third phase. The culminating event of third phase for me, when I went through Parris Island in 1993 and 94, was they called it basic warrior training. So it was a week-long event where you went to the field and you basically simulated a combat environment, digging fighting holes, doing some force-on-force training with simulated munitions against an opposing force. And then that culminated in a 25-mile hike. Yeah. And then graduation was about a week later. So that final week at boot camp was pretty easy compared to the rest of it. So there's different competitions along the way. In each phase, there's a different component to hand-to-hand combat that you learn. So they don't do boxing anymore at Marine Corps boot camp. But when I was there, boxing was a big part of it. So you would start off with boxing and then learn what they called then was line training, which has evolved now into the Marine Corps martial arts program. So it was a martial arts program that would teach you hand-to-hand combat, both defensive and offensive techniques. And then in the third phase, there was, I forget exactly what they called it, but it was employing hand-to-hand combat techniques with a weapon. So we used what's called pugil sticks, and you would fight one-on-one and two-on-two. So those were some pretty interesting events during boot camp. And then there's also, along the way, there's different close order drill competitions, so marching, formation marching. So from first phase you do basic drill competition. Second phase is more complicated drill movements, and then third phase is like the championship. And there's different trophies that are given out for different platoons within the company during that period. So you go through, like I was platoon 3137 when I went through boot camp. So 3rd Battalion, and then I was in Mike Company, and then I was in 3rd Platoon. And the 3137 is that's the number of platoons that have gone through that battalion during the fiscal year. So we were 127th company to go through Parris Island. And there's 4 battalions at Parris Island. So there's 1st Battalion, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion, and then 4th Battalion. And this is probably going to change in the future, but when I went through boot camp, and this is how it's been up until recently, and it hasn't changed yet, is 4th Battalion was all female. So boot camp is not integrated. There's other services that have integrated their boot camps between male and female, but it's always been a philosophy of the Marine Corps that we train everybody, and then we integrate into our when we go to our MLS schools, our military occupational specialty schools, but that's probably going to change. So I don't know what else you want to know about training at boot camp. I think I covered pretty much all of it.
Yeah, you got it. You got a lot there. So I know you said you were at Parris Island from 93 or 93, 94.
Yeah.
When were you deployed?
So I deployed. My first deployment was in the fall of 1994 to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I did another deployment after I was commissioned. My first deployment on active duty as an officer was in July of 2001. So it was a scheduled Western Pacific deployment. So the way the Marine Corps has traditionally worked is we do what are called Marine Expeditionary Unit deployments. So the 15th MU is based out of San Diego. We get aboard Navy ships and we go into the Western Pacific and basically wait for something to happen. And we also do that in the Atlantic, and there's also usually a shorter MU deployment cycle that's going on in the Pacific, but it's based out of Okinawa, Japan, which is where another Marine Corps base is. So at any time, there's always 3 Marine Expeditionary Units that are pre-positioned somewhere around the world as a contingency for something to happen. So that's what we were doing in July of 2001 when we left San Diego. We went to Hawaii, and then we went to did a short stop in Hawaii, and then we went to Australia. And we arrived in Australia on, I think it was either the 31st of August or the 1st of September, somewhere around there. And then we did about 10 days of training with the Australian Army. And then we came back to Darwin, Australia, on what was already September 11th in Australia. So we had been on Liberty, which is when you get time off from the ship. It's called Liberty. So we'd been on Liberty for about 4 or 5 hours, and the way I found out what was going on back at home was I'd planned on calling my wife. We'd gone to dinner with a bunch of my buddies. And so I'd planned on calling my wife about the time that she was getting up in San Diego. And so it was probably about 8:30, I think, her time. She was in San Diego. I called her, and as I was walking to the phone booth, I saw my platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant McGee, and he had just talked to his wife. And this was back before cell phones, so we actually had to use pay phones to call people. So I called. He said to me, yeah, there's been some kind of terrorist attack in New York City again, because there had been the previous terrorist attack that had happened in the World Trade Center. I don't remember exactly what year it was. It was in the 90s. So, figured, something happened. Was not at all expecting it to be the scope of what obviously occurred on 9/11. So I called my wife and I said, hey, why don't you turn on the TV and tell me what's going on. And so she was telling me that there had been what they thought was a small commuter plane that had crashed into one of the towers. And I think it was as I was talking to her, the second plane hit. And that, as soon as that happened, there was no doubt in my mind that it was something extremely serious that was going on. And I said to her, I got to go. I'm not sure, when I'm going to be able to talk to you again. And I went across the street. We were all hanging out at this Irish pub. So I went across the street and there was like a live band playing. And I told all of my friends what I'd heard and what was going on. And then I left to go try to call her again. And I got her on the phone. And at that point, I think that the plane had gone into the Pentagon. And so I talked to her for a little while longer, got some more information, and then I went back over to the bar. And at that point, they had the TVs on. The band wasn't even playing. And shortly after that, we had Marines show up for everybody to go back to the ships. So we ended up running all over Darwin, trying to find as many Marines as we could to get them back to the ships. Got it back aboard the USS Comstock, which was the ship I was on. And then the entire amphibious ready group, which was the USS Peleliu, the USS Comstock, and the USS Dubuque, got underway and went into the North Arabian Sea, where we did what's called gator squares. So the amphibious ships just did like a box, just waiting for somebody to tell us what to do. And then, long story short, on Thanksgiving Eve in 2001, we did an amphibious offload into Pakistan, into an airfield called Pasni, and then via Air Force C-17 aircraft, we flew into Afghanistan. So, and there was also another operation at the same time via helicopter to take Marines into Afghanistan as well. So there was kind of two waves that went in. I was in the second wave. First wave was, and the way that the MU is organized, it's organized around a battalion landing team. So it's an infantry battalion from the 1st Marine Division. It's 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, hence Battalion Landing Team 1-1. And then everything is built around that. So you've got the air component, and then the ground component, the logistics component. And we were part of the ground component. So we were working for Battalion Landing Team 1-1. We were the Light Armor Reconnaissance Company that was attached to them. It's about 3,000 Marines total that make up the MU. Not all of those Marines went into Afghanistan because, for whatever reason, General Tommy Franks, who was the CENTCOM commander at the time, decided that there were only going to be, I think, 1,000 Marines in Afghanistan. So we went. They left the tanks and the other tracked vehicles aboard the ships. Those guys never got into Afghanistan in 2001. So we were the largest conventional armored unit that was in Afghanistan in 2001, in November of 2001. So once we arrived at Camp Rhino, which was in southern Afghanistan, almost immediately we were tasked to go up to Route 1, which is the main highway. It's like a U-shaped highway that goes from one end of Afghanistan to the other. It's the only, at the time, was the only like paved road. So there weren't any other paved roads in Afghanistan but Route 1. And the Taliban at the time was, they still had Kandahar, which is where it's basically the birthplace of the Taliban. So they were in Kandahar, which was up to the north east of where our position was. And then they were also had Lashkar Gah, which is in the central part of Helmand province in Afghanistan. So we were, and they were transiting Route 1 between Lashkar Gah and Kandahar. So we went up to do ambushes on Route 1. So we utilized, we call them tactical air control party ambushes. So we utilized both the LEV-25, which is the vehicle, the 8-wheeled vehicle that we use, has a 25 millimeter cannon on it, as well as 7.62 millimeter machine guns. And then we carry Marines in the back, riflemen in the back. We call them scouts. But what we also brought with us were forward air controllers and tactical air party controllers. And what they could do was vector close air support for us onto targets. So the first night that we did an ambush on Route 1, first platoon, which I was in charge of second platoon, but first platoon went up to Route 1, and they stopped a convoy. It was, I don't know, 4 or 5 trucks, plus another vehicle that was kind of their advance party, destroyed them, and then they came back to where our position was. And then the following night, I went up with my platoon, went up to do an ambush on Route 1, and there was absolutely nothing moving between Kandahar and Lashkar Gah. I mean, the one event that we had against the Taliban early on, it was like the word got out that you don't move on Route 1 at night or the Marines are going to kill you. So, which was good for us because then nobody was really going to mess with us after that. But so we were part of what was called Task Force 58. And this task force was established to utilize both the 15th MEU and also the 26th MEU, which was in the in the Mediterranean, and put both of those elements on the ground at the same time. So there was a large conventional force that was in Afghanistan. And prior to all of us arriving in Afghanistan on the conventional side, there was the whole thing that was going on with the CIA, as well as special forces working with the Northern Alliance against the Taliban. And by the time we got there, the fight was pretty much over. I mean, they had very effectively destroyed the Taliban in using the Northern Alliance forces in Afghanistan, the indigenous Afghanis. So once that happened on Route 1, where that whole ambush kind of stopped everybody from moving, it completely changed the dynamic for the Taliban. They didn't want to really engage us on that road. But a couple nights later, the Taliban had a lot of tanks. They were all in Kandahar. And so they sent a force of tanks from Kandahar to try to come down and attack Camp Rhino. And they got like 2 miles outside of the city, and basically every single close air support platform available just completely decimated them. So shortly after that, the Taliban fell. They fell in Kandahar, they fell in Lashkar Gah. I mean, they just completely collapsed. Because they found that there's nothing, they couldn't move without U.S. forces detecting them. And then anytime they try to mass, they would find themselves in a lot of trouble. So once that happened in Kandahar, they needed somebody to go seize the airfield. So we went from, we had been up, operating in and around the desert around Route 1. So we were tasked with going to Kandahar, up Route 1 to the east, and taking the airfield at Kandahar. So we actually moved to a location where they could fly General Mattis, who later was the 1st Marine Division commander. I'm not sure if he was the CENTCOM commander, but General Mattis is like this. He is a mythical figure within the Marine Corps. There's certain people that have garnered legendary status within the Marine Corps, and General Mattis is one of those guys. We always talk about Chesty Puller and Dan Daly and Smedley Butler, like all these famous Marines from, Korea on back to World War I, the Banana Wars down in South America. This is my generation's Chesty Puller. He was nicknamed Mad Dog Mattis. And he's a very inspiring person. He's a very charismatic individual, and he's also rather unpolished, which Marines tend to like. So this picture here of Jim Mattis is him giving the rules of engagement brief to our company before we left to go do our ambushes on Route 1. And then later, as I was getting to, they flew him to us, and he rode with us in to take the airfield at Kandahar and establish his headquarters and he was the commander of Task Force 58. So after that, we stayed in Afghanistan for several months. We left in February. Mainly, we were doing security patrols around Kandahar. We were involved in planning for a number of operations that never happened, which was a little bit frustrating, including one operation to try to either kill or capture a very high-value target that is still hasn't been caught to this day. We were all joking about whether or not we'd get the $1 million reward for Bin Laden if we found him. We never found him, so we never found out. But we were also planning on an operation into Tora Bora, which later became Operation Anaconda, which the Army actually did after we left. So once we were kind of on the deck at the airfield in Kandahar, we were waiting for the Army to show up, because doctrinally that's how we work. The Marines go in, they see something, big Army comes in after us, and we go to do other things. So in February, late February of 2002, we left. We left Afghanistan, went back to aboard the ships, and then we went into Qatar, which is in the Persian Gulf, and then onto the ships after that. We've been in Kuwait for a while. I can't remember if we did go to Doha, so we were in Kuwait for a short time. That's where we got back on the ships. And then we went back to Australia. So we hadn't had any time off since September 11th.
Yeah.
So we went back to Australia, and we spent a little over a week. We went to Perth and we went to Sydney. And I don't think Australia was ever the same after we showed up, because we had a really good time. It was a lot of fun. So then we came home. So that was my first deployment to Afghanistan in 2001, 2002.
Yeah. Now, just going back to the attacks on September 11th, you said you came back and had told everybody what you had heard. What was everybody else's reactions to?
I think what you would expect, a mixture of disbelief, anger. It was very difficult for, I think, everybody involved to really process what was happening, especially for us being in Australia and not at home. It was a very different, a very different experience than most Americans had on 9/11. We were at a point when we came back to the ships where I remember standing on the fantail or actually it was the flight deck of the Comstock, and I could look down over the side of the ship. I could see the bank of payphones that were there right on the pier, and it was like there was a sea of Marines that were desperately trying to call home and find out what was going on. Yeah. So there was that. I had a Marine whose mother was, I think she was part of the cleaning crew for Windows on the World, which was the restaurant at the top of the towers. I think it was Tower 2 that Windows on the World was in. But anyway, he was trying to call her to find out if she had been at work that day. She wasn't. I had another one of my fellow officers, who's a platoon commander in Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. He was trying to call his dad because his dad worked in the Pentagon. He was a colonel at the time, I think, in the Army. And his office was actually in the same place where the plane hit, but he wasn't at work that day. So, I mean, you can imagine the different emotions that are happening. So there's all these people that are trying to call home. We're trying to make sure we've got everybody back from Darwin, that we didn't leave any Marines there. We didn't. We got everybody back. And then we were also, we always talk about force protection measures in the Marine Corps. And that's, our outward looking preparations for something to happen. So if we're doing anything, regardless of where we are, we're always doing some kind of risk assessment to figure out what the danger is for our Marines. So we went from worrying about Liberty incidents to worrying about the ships being attacked. So we were actually setting up machine guns on the bow and the stern of the ship. The Navy was manning their weapon systems, and I remember our executive officer come up to me and he's like, "I just handed out ammunition to a bunch of drunk Marines," because everybody had been drinking. I mean, it was, that's what you do on Liberty when you go drinking, So, I mean, at the time it was like, okay, well, I guess we got to do something. So we went from this. I think we assumed the worst was going to happen. So anything at that point was possible because of what had happened at home. So it was a very, very strange night. Yeah. Probably the strangest night of my entire life.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Now, what was life like on the Comstock and at sea?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question. My sister-in-law and her family just went on a Disney cruise, and they had asked our family. I have 2 daughters who love princesses and Disney, and they asked us if we wanted to go, and I said no. I've spent enough time on ship. I mean, you can imagine there's several hundred people. The Comstock is a smaller ship, so it doesn't have as many people on it as the 11 or 1,200 people that would be on the USS Peleliu, which is the big deck ship that has helicopters on it. It's like a small aircraft carrier. Our ship, the Comstock, is smaller. There's a flight deck, so you can land 2 helicopters on the back. But I mean, there's a huge difference between the size of our ship and the big deck, which we lovingly refer to as the Death Star, because that's where all the higher ups were, all the lieutenant colonels, which is what I am now. So, I mean, life for Marines on a Navy amphibious ship is pretty boring. I mean, there's a lot of lifting and working out. There's a lot of video game playing and watching movies over and over again, because you only have so many movies to watch, right? Yeah. And a lot of eating. So it's challenging to keep your Marines from, just getting fat when you're on ship, because there's a lot of time spent just, not doing much. And it's challenging for us to find training opportunities when you're on the ship. So, I mean, there's only so many times that you can go to the back of the ship and, shoot at targets. Yeah. So there's only so many sand table exercises you can do on tactics. So it's challenging to try to keep people interested and engaged. After 9/11 happened, it wasn't quite as hard, because everybody really felt like there was a purpose. We figured we were going to be going somewhere and doing something, so we were preparing for those things. There was a lot of planning that was going on for contingency operations. We planned a non-combatant evacuation operation, which is basically when the Marines go in to take all of the American and civilians out of an area. So they'll go to the embassy, and we were planning for one in Islamabad.
Mm-hmm.
So, or no, it's Karachi, Pakistan. So we planned to have to forcibly enter Pakistan, go to the American school, go to the embassy, and bring everybody out.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of time spent planning for those kind of contingency operations at the
Mm-hmm.
officer level. But again, you've got your Marines who are not as engaged as much of the time. So you got to find interesting things for them to do to keep them out of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So
Now, do you remember, like, when you were first deployed? Like, what did it feel like when you were first deployed and got to where you were going?
So are you talking about like deployed on the ship or when I actually was in Afghanistan?
Afghanistan.
Okay. Yeah, it was. So when we flew from, probably the most remarkable part was when we flew from Pakistan into Afghanistan. It was at night.
Mm-hmm.
We landed on a dirt runway. When the aircraft was getting ready for its final descent, they had all the Marines come to the back where the ramp is, and they took tie-down straps,
Mm-hmm.
and we all laid down, and they strapped our legs down, and that was like the position that we were in when we landed. So that was really odd. I've never been in a plane before when, somebody just like strapped me to the back of the plane.
Yeah.
And so we landed, and we stood up. We're waiting for the ramp to come down, and so we have different weapons conditions that we have. There are 4 of them that we use in the Marine Corps. Condition 1 is your magazine inserted in your weapon and your bolt home on a chamber that has a round in the chamber. So you're ready to fight.
Mm-hmm.
And I had my Marines do that before we got off the plane because we didn't know what we were walking into.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I remember, telling my Marines to go condition 1, and they just did it. But the crew chief on the Air Force aircraft was kind of like, this is real. And that, for me, I didn't really think about it at the time until I saw his reaction, and that really drove it home. Like, this is real.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, fortunately, we brought everybody home. But that was, again, kind of one of those similar moments to the experience that I had at the MCRD sign going
Mm-hmm.
to Parris Island. Who's coming back? Is everybody coming back? Who's not going to come back?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think that was the first time in my career as an officer when I was really faced with the responsibility that I had.
Mm-hmm.
To these 107 guys that were working for me.
Right.
It was a rather striking moment.
Mm-hmm. And can you just tell us again your assignment while you were?
So I was the platoon commander for 2nd Platoon
Right.
of Bravo Company,
Right.
1st Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion. And so our battalion at the time didn't deploy together. They would chop out companies that would deploy
Right.
with infantry battalions. So I was a platoon commander. I was like the lowliest officer. I was a 1st lieutenant at the
Mm-hmm.
time. So I was 29,
Mm-hmm.
I think. I think that's right.
And can you describe like a typical day on base for us?
So do you want, is this about Afghanistan again?
Yeah.
Well, so there's no typical day.
No.
When we were there, and I went back to Afghanistan when I was a major with another infantry battalion in 2010, 2011. Those were regular days. Like you could go into work in the morning, and I didn't have the opportunity to go outside the wire all that often. So most of my days were pretty typical. When we were in Afghanistan in 2001, there weren't any bases. So, we would set up anywhere we wanted to, and every day was different.
Mm-hmm.
Every day was something new. Even when we ended up at the airfield in Kandahar, there was something new every day. I mean,
Yeah.
typically, once we got to the airfield, it became a little bit more routine because we had positions that we would man at certain times of the day, and then there was downtime, time for planning, things like that, because we were kind of behind a perimeter, so we were in more of a defensive position. When we were offensive, when we first got into Afghanistan, it was moving every day to a different location, never using the same route twice, and always looking for a way to engage the Taliban. So that required a lot of movement. We covered our first movement from Camp Rhino. When we went up to Route 1, we traveled for 19 hours straight, and in 2 separate units to infiltrate up to where we were going to set our first patrol base. And I mean, we started out in daylight in the morning, and we didn't get to where we were going until nearly a day later, and it was in the middle of the night. So those kinds of days kind of blend together. There's no real it's all one like long event of doing different things, trying to find the bad guys and trying not to get killed doing it. So
yeah. So then, what was it like when you had downtime? Like, what did you guys do? Like, what was it like living there?
Well, so we ended up getting a bunch of mail finally when we got to Kandahar to the airfield, the international airport. So we actually had like Risk games and a bunch of board games that people had sent. It was around Christmas time.
Okay.
So everybody was getting lots of mail, magazines, books and stuff like that. So that's mainly what we would do. One of the things that Marines do a lot of is playing spades, so card games. That's the kind of stuff we would do in our down, or sleep, because you're always tired. So you're always trying to find some time to get some extra sleep. But there wasn't really a lot of opportunity to call home when we were in Afghanistan the first time. There were some phones available eventually at the airport, but we didn't see those until, I don't know, it was probably around Christmas. We did have the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, and trying to remember the guy's name that showed up. It's like a famous actor, Wayne Newton. And the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders came. I didn't get to see him though, because I was doing my job.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
Now, can you tell me about some of your most memorable experiences, if there are?
Is this a family-friendly show?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not that. It's pretty funny. I have to tell the story. So, when we were doing our movement up to Route 1 to take the airfield in Kandahar, we were set up in our final attack position just south of Route 1. We were waiting for helicopters to show up to do what's called armed reconnaissance. So they fly ahead and behind us, and they look for any potential ambush sites or bad guys or whatever. They're kind of like our eyes in the sky, give us a little bit of extra security so we can move quickly to get to where we're going. And we were sitting just short of this town, and my platoon's job was to, once we were given the order to go, we were to go up to Route 1 and establish a blocking position facing to basically the 6 o'clock position of where the company was going to move, to start moving down Route 1 towards Kandahar. So I'm listening to the radio. I've got 2 radios behind me. One is set on the my platoon frequency, so I can talk to my guys, and the other one's set on the company frequency, so I can hear the company commander if he wants me to do anything. And then I had a forward air controller in the back, and he's listening to the traffic from the helicopters, from the pilots. And I got to take a shit. And I am, like, I really have to go. And I'm like, if we get into contact, like, I'm going to have a problem. and my gunner is like sitting down below. He's buttoned up. I'm standing up out of the turret. And he's like, sir, he's like, you better get off and do your business because I have to sit down here. So I'm like, all right. So I hop off the vehicle and I get my little e-tool. It's a shovel. I dig a hole right next to the vehicle and I sit on my e-tool and I take care of business. And as I'm doing that, I hear my scouts in the back giggling. They're like, hee, 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 hee. And I hear click, click. And they're taking pictures of me taking a dump by the side of the road. And it was, I mean, I turned around and looked at them and they got a really good picture of that. And it was one of the things they gave me when I left was that picture. So that was one of the most memorable things that happened during that deployment.
Yeah.
But there's lots of stuff like that. There's a lot of little stories like that you know are involved in any Marines deployment anywhere. Mm-hmm. We always try to, I think, try to find the humor in everything. There's mm-hmm. always the, you know, you hear about gallows humor. There's some of the funniest stories are humorous and they take place during some of the most stressful events. Yeah. I think there's another story that was very memorable. So we had our Marine aircraft were inserting a Australian Special Operations Force into a suspected Al-Qaeda training camp, and they had a mishap with the aircraft, and they had to leave the aircraft there, and they sent us to go recover it. So we were the only ones who had the capability to tow anything significant because we have a variant of the light armored vehicle that it's basically a giant wrecker. It has a big boom on it and a really powerful winch. So I was tasked with taking them to this area where the aircraft was, and recovering it for them because it was stuck on top of a hill. Mm-hmm. And the aircraft couldn't take off because the landing gear had folded up, so it was sitting right on its nose and it was on a weird angle. So they needed to get it to a point a flat position where they could block it and then they'd be able to actually take off. So what we did is we went to this area and we took our vehicles and basically drug that thing off the side of this mountain. And it was, I have a really good picture of it that I'll make sure that I give to you guys of, you know, the vehicle sitting at the bottom and this giant helicopter just being drugged down the side of this hill. But it was very memorable because one of the things that we do is, you know, we are trained to recover each other because our vehicles can get stuck because they weigh 12 tons. I mean, they're really heavy vehicles, so we have to be really proficient at doing it. So it took 3 of those vehicles, 2 LAV-25s with their winches to stabilize the aircraft as the recovery vehicle pulled it down off the hill. So it was a very interesting engineering problem for us to solve. And it took, I wasn't participating in much of it because the duty experts, the guys on the ground that really understand how to recover vehicles, not the officers. They're the staff NCOs and the non-commissioned officers, the guys that work on that stuff every day. Yeah. So I got to kind of just sit back and watch the whole thing happen. So it was really interesting. It was one of the more memorable things that we did. Yeah. Plus, our movement from Kandahar to that site was at night. We were the only ones really moving. That was pretty stressful because we had to move from where the airfield was, the airport in Kandahar, through the city of Kandahar, which is a built-up urban area and a bit challenging in terms of a security perspective, like force protection perspective for us moving through. And we always would try to use speed as security. It's one of the things we do in the Marine Corps. So we had to move at night. I'd only been through Kandahar one other time, and I was following everybody else. So it was my responsibility to navigate through the city of Kandahar without getting lost and go 300 kilometers to find this aircraft. And that was really the first independent operation that is definitely the first one I did in combat by myself. Well, that's not true. I did the ambush on Route 1. But this one was, somebody handed me a job and said, go do it. And with very, very little planning. And I went and did it. And there was nobody else around. So I didn't have, when I did my ambush patrol up to Route 1 that first time, I had somebody supporting me in the air the entire time. I had, I think, a total of 75 different aircraft throughout the entire evolution that was flying in support of me, that I could talk to find out what's going on around me. I didn't have that when I went to go do the aircraft recovery. And I was moving through an area that I had never been in. We didn't have a lot of really good intelligence on what the enemy picture was. We figured they could be almost anywhere based on all of the studying that we had done about the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s, or the late 70s, early 80s. So that was stressful. I mean, and I was relying on, I was too far away for my normal VHF radio communication, so I couldn't talk to them on VHF. We didn't have the capability to use high frequency radios on the move. We'd have to stop and set them up. So all I had was satellite communications, which at the time weren't very reliable. So I was really out there on my own. And that was a pretty amazing evolution for a young guy to like me with not a lot of combat experience at all to do. I mean, it was, and everything worked out great, but it was like my baptism of fire, really, as a leader. Fortunately, nobody shot at us while we did it, but it was very challenging from a logistical standpoint, from just the idea of linking up with a force that we hadn't ever worked with before is always a dangerous thing when you got when you got Marines facing Marines with weapons and you're trying to meet in a place at night. It's always a bit dicey. But we're talking about Australians and Marines. I mean, we couldn't talk to them. We didn't know who they were. We'd never worked with them before. So it was tough to try to figure out how to crack that nut and make it work the right way. But such is life, I guess, in the Marine Corps. You're asked to do those kinds of things pretty routinely, and it definitely was a significant event, I think, in my growth as a professional and as an officer. Yeah.
And were you awarded with any medals or accommodations? Or
I got a Navy Achievement Medal, but
okay,
and that's of very little significance to me.
How did you get it?
It was for that operation.
For that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, NAMs are kind of like getting a cookie.
Really?
So yeah.
So it was just kind of like, here's your reward.
Yeah, I think the one award that I got when I was in Afghanistan that the entire company was awarded was our Combat Action Ribbon. I mean, that one really meant a lot to everybody that's involved, because that's kind of your check in the box. Like you went there and you did it. You got the T-shirt. So that's a pretty significant event in a Marine's career. To get to have that award. I mean, it's a significant thing. It means a lot for your career progression too. I mean, when you get up in the higher ranks, it's really competitive. Not saying that anyone in the Marine Corps should go hunting for a Combat Action Ribbon. There's people that do that, but if you are lucky is not the right word, but if you have the opportunity, if the opportunity is presented to you to earn that ribbon, it makes you're just in a different category than someone that has never been there. And I mean, you're not going to get once you get to the higher ranks, you're not going to get selected for promotion or get the really good jobs if you don't have that experience, if you haven't been exposed to that. And it's a double-edged sword as well. I mean, we all know about PTSD and issues surrounding veteran suicides and everything else, and there's not too much of that when you don't have a combat action ribbon.
Yeah.
So.
And how did your family feel about you winning that combat action ribbon?
I don't know that I've ever really talked to my family about that. I think my family was just happy that I came home. Well, at the time, I was just married to my wife, so we didn't have any kids yet. But yeah, it's never really been a subject that we've discussed.
Okay.
I don't think ever. She knows I have it, but we don't really. I mean, I don't really talk about it too much.
Okay. And how did it feel being away from your wife and your family for so long?
I had experience with being away. I mean, I think that's part of like the whole evolution of becoming a Marine, or in any other branch of the service. You go through extended periods of time when you're not with your friends and family. So I was doing my job. I think a lot of times it's harder on family members when their spouse or their son or daughter is deployed, because they don't know what's going on with them every day, and it's scary. Whereas we're obviously trained to do our jobs in that environment, and we know what's happening every day, and the time actually goes really fast most of the time. There's some times when it kind of slows down, but I don't know. I mean, when you go to war after something like September 11th, and you're a Marine, I mean, that's where you're supposed to be. So, you miss your family, but you're also doing your job.
Right.
So, I mean, that's why we go back multiple times, because it's what we do.
And would you say you had a lot of types of situations that you went through that you were under a lot of pressure, a lot of stress? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that goes for, I think, everyone who's served in a combat MOS, or who's been in combat in a support MOS as well. I mean, it's very stressful. That first time, and so when I was in a light armored reconnaissance platoon commander, we don't typically, and this was very early in the global war on terrorism, so this was before really we understood the improvised explosive device threat. It wasn't prevalent in Afghanistan. We were more worried about mines that were left over from the war with the Soviets than IEDs. So that first time that we went to do a real combat mission, and I'm standing up out of that turret with my head exposed and my body exposed, it was rather sobering. I mean, and I had to consciously in my head say, there's nothing you can do if you get shot. So I just got to do my job, because there's all these other guys that are relying on me to do my job. And that's, I think, how many Marines feel. It's what you're required to do to support the person that's on your right and left. That's the most important thing. So for most Marines, it's easy to kind of flip that switch and not really worry about what's going to happen to you, and worry about what's going to happen to the people around you. But that first time, like standing up out of that turret, I was just kind of like, somebody's going to shoot me. Someone's going to put one between my running lights. There's nothing I can do about it. And that's a scary thought.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Now, did you make any close friendships with anybody while you were in the service, or?
Yes, I mean that's especially when you go on deployment with people. Just even if it's a peacetime deployment, you spend a lot of time with them, and living in such close proximity with someone, and then you add the dynamic of being in combat with them.
Yeah.
Yes, they're lifelong friendships. Probably some that are as close as a relationship as I have with my wife.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I served with predominantly men, so I can't say that I have. There aren't any females that I served with on either of my deployments that I have this kind of a close relationship with, that I would, say that they're like my sister. But
Mm-hmm.
these guys were like my brothers.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of the guys who I served with in Afghanistan the first time, who were working for me in my
Mm-hmm.
platoon, that have now gotten out of the Marine Corps, and we're still friends. We talk probably a couple times a week via Facebook and social media. And I think any one of us would do just about anything for one another.
Yeah.
That's the level of friendship that you develop. And there are some guys that I wouldn't give the time of day to, because they didn't do what they were supposed to do when we were there.
Yeah.
And those people we don't keep in contact with. But there's definitely a really tight group of people, even guys that weren't in my platoon,
Mm-hmm.
but served in the company, that I'm still really good friends with.
Yeah.
Guys that there was a guy that I lived with on the ship, and he was a weapons platoon commander from 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, and he still is one of my great friends.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that had to do with the fact that we lived together.
Yeah.
It's like a college roommate. You either love them or you hate them, right?
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah. And how did it feel when you were told that you were going home, that you were done your deployment?
For the first deployment, I think we were all actually pissed off, because we were supposed to be part of this operation to go into Tora Bora,
Mm-hmm.
And try to cut off the Taliban from escaping into Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And we weren't going to do it. They were going to give the mission to the Army. And we were mad that we were leaving without, kind of finishing the job that we thought we were supposed to do.
Yeah.
Once we got out of Afghanistan, I think we were all pretty happy that we were going home.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for the most part, just about everybody was disappointed and pissed off that we were leaving when we left.
Mm-hmm. And
second deployment, we were all like, yeah, let's go home.
so you say you were more so happy about coming back from your second deployment. Any other emotions going through your mind when you returned home from Afghanistan?
Well, from the first time, it was weird coming back to the United States after that. It was 2002, so the Iraq War hadn't started.
Mm-hmm.
So we literally came back to a country that was kind of just going about doing its business, just like it was before we left.
Mm-hmm.
There were things that had changed, but for the most part, aside from what happened on September 11th, the ugly part of what was going on in Afghanistan and the fact that we were a country at war was not really realized by the rest of the country, and that was very difficult for me personally to deal with. It really was upsetting.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a long time to get over that.
Yeah.
A long time. And I don't think really until I moved back to State College in 2006, even then, it was tough. It took me coming back and really reintegrating back into the civilian community before I could kind of put that kind of stuff to rest.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for people, I think, that have seen those kinds of things and participated in those events to integrate back into civilian society, because there's a definite perspective change that happens when you go through something like that, and it's not something that I think a lot of people are equipped to deal with by themselves. I think as a service and as a military, we've done a lot better at the mental health side of all of that. But I didn't have any of that when I came back the first time. It was like, hey, welcome back. Thanks for a good job. And then a year later, I was in Newport, Rhode Island, working at the Naval Academy Prep School, which was a Navy command, which is a little bit different place than I'd ever been before. The Navy and the Marine Corps have kind of a love-hate relationship as well, as you may know. And there were all these kids, they were going through this preparatory school to go to the Naval Academy and the Coast Guard Academy. So it was a very different environment than I had been in, a few months before. So in the fall of 2002, that's where I was. In the fall of 2001, I was in Afghanistan, or November. I guess that's the fall. And so on September 11th, 2002, the first anniversary of 9/11, I was in a very strange place, like this academic environment in beautiful Newport, Rhode Island. And I think that's probably when I really first experienced what had happened on September 11th. I locked myself in my office and I listened to the rebroadcast of the Howard Stern show from September 11th. And that was, not being in the United States when it happened, you didn't have the same perspective. And I think that really brought home everything that had happened and how, worried people were. And, I didn't have the experience of, on September 12th looking up at the sky and there's no planes flying around. Something that people always talk about. I had the experience of being in Afghanistan and looking up and seeing the planes flying and going, those guys are flying for me. So, that is just very, very different. And that experience of listening to the Howard Stern show like it was September 11th, sitting in my office, was surreal. Probably even more surreal than when the event actually happened. We saw pictures of it. We saw like the news, but we didn't live it that day like everybody else did. So
Now, how would you say your experiences have influenced the way you think about war or the military in general?
I think I had a much more romanticized view of military service and also probably the experience of combat in general before I think that's probably common for a lot of people who go through, who are in combat. My calculations on seeing the world are less black and white than they used to be. I think one of the things that happens in the Marine Corps with people who are not just leaders, but I think everybody who's kind of indoctrinated into the way the Marine Corps operates and the way we think, there's some very defined lines between, right and wrong. And a lot of those, when I was a corporal, for example, I had a very specific view of what was, a good Marine and a bad Marine. The right things to do as a Marine and the wrong things to do. Everything from like the way your haircut was to how your uniform looked to the color socks that you wore. We always have, a big no-no is wearing white socks with your, combat utilities and your boots. Not putting your hands in your pockets. And I think, those things became a lot less important than they were before. I think, good order and discipline is obviously something the Marines value very highly, but there's a place for it. And then there's another place where you should, as a leader, be able to let a person slide on a couple things. And I think I learned that perspective definitely changed me. But when it comes down to the ideas of a Marine being technically and tactically proficient in terms of a warfighter, there's not a lot of gray area there.
Yeah.
So, and that is absolutely 100% reinforced from my perspective from being in combat. You know, there's things that you can, you know, if the only thing you have to wear is white socks with your combat uniform in Afghanistan, I'm not going to yell at you because there's no reason to. But there are some people that will, that make it a big deal. If you put your hands in your pockets when you're cold, it's not a big deal to me. If you put your hands in your pockets when you're like at Camp Pendleton in San Diego, probably not the right thing to do. But if you do it in Afghanistan, I don't care. Like, I really don't care. So, I mean, I think that was the biggest impact on my perspective. The other thing too is I think a function of I definitely had PTSD. I still deal with PTSD issues from my 2 deployments. First one more so than my second one, and that it was, you know, kind of, I wouldn't say life changing, but I had to figure out how to deal with that, and it didn't impact me for probably 5 years after I came back from Afghanistan the first time, until my wife had our first child. And after my daughter was born, I had the night she was born, I think at like 3 a.m. or something like that. And it was a pretty traumatic birth event for my wife. Her labor lasted a long time. There were some minor complications. When my daughter was born, she wasn't breathing at first. So like there was a period of like a second where I was like, oh my God, you know, like my daughter didn't make it. And I think those things triggered some things in my my PTSD brain that caused me to have the most horrific and graphic dream about combat that I'd ever had. And after that, I really, I had to get, like, actually go see some people to help me negotiate through that kind of stuff, because, you know, all of the things you hear about hypervigilance and, like, I couldn't turn it off. Like, it wasn't like I was having flashbacks or anything like that, but I couldn't turn off the level of preparedness that I had. And that all stems from, you know, the experience of, you know, being in combat. You know, a simple thing like going to bed at night, before you crawl in your sleeping bag, when you're, you know, making sure all of your weapons are where you can reach them, and you're, you know, keeping your boots on to sleep, so in case something happens, you don't have to put your boots on. You know, going through that whole mental preparation of standing up in that turret. And then, you know, the other things that go along with being in a combat environment, it's difficult to deal with, and I think that for me, you know, I dealt with it very well. I had to get some help to deal with it effectively, but there's a lot of people out there that don't get that kind of help. Either one, they don't admit that they need help, which is the first step for any of them. They don't want help. They think they can deal with it themselves, and it becomes a real serious mental health issue. And again, I think the service in general is doing, and the military has done a great job of trying to turn that around. But we still have 22 veteran suicides a day, and I mean, that's way too many. One is too many. 22 is ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. Now, how would you define the word freedom?
I don't think I have to define it. I think all you got to do is read the Constitution, and the definition is right there. The Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. I wouldn't want to put it in my own words, because I think that's the defining document. That's the document that I have taken an oath to defend and support. So it's right there.
Okay. Good answer. Is there anything that you'd like to add that we didn't cover?
No, I don't think so. It's great to have the opportunity to come in here and share my story. I'm glad that you all are doing this. It's a good opportunity for not only me to connect with a student like yourself who's in broadcast journalism, but it's also an opportunity to kind of bridge that divide between the military community and the civilian community, which I think is extremely important. And I don't think we're doing a very good job with that. I think that there's a lot of veterans that still feel disconnected from their civilian lives and their civilian family and friends. And I think there's a lot of civilians that don't have the opportunity to engage with veterans enough. So there's, their perspective is very different on a lot of things than mine would be.
Yeah.
So anytime that we can share our experiences, I shared mostly mine today, but anytime that we can expose each other to, our perspective on America and our community and the way we see the world is a good thing. There's so few veterans that we have, and there's so few people that are serving in the military that I think it's difficult for all of us as a community and as a nation to really get. We just don't have the ability to relate to each other like we used to. It's not like in when it was World War II, everybody was invested in what was going on. It's very different now. It's less than 1% of the population that's actually going to go to a place like Afghanistan or Iraq. It's going to be involved in doing what the nation is asking them to do.
Yeah.
And it's very hard for civilians to understand what military people do because they've never been exposed to it. So again, this is a great thing. It's one of the reasons why I volunteered to come in and do it.
Well, we thank you for joining us today, and we also thank you for your service and all you do to continue your service. So on behalf of everybody here, thank you for what you did and what you still do, and I hope you have a great night.
Thanks.
No,
appreciate it.
No problem.
So this was a collage of pictures that the company put together, Bravo Company. Our nickname were the Vikings, and this was for our Western Pacific deployment in 2001, where we ended up participating in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. The actual first operation was called Operation Swift Freedom. So just kind of going around the pictures that are here in the upper left-hand corner. That's a picture that of LAV, a light armored vehicle. It's called an LAV-25 because it has a 25 millimeter Bushmaster chain gun mounted on it. That's on Route 1. You can see that Afghan vehicle in front of the LAV is rather old, but that's kind of a typical scene on the roadways when you're moving around Afghanistan. It wasn't any different in 2010 when I was there. Probably in 2010, 2011, you find more white Toyota Corollas because it seemed like everybody drove a white Toyota Corolla. The picture in the middle, I believe, is a picture of one of our vehicles at sunset at Kandahar International Airport after we had taken the airfield in late 2001, just before Christmas. On the upper right-hand corner, that's a picture of an LAV-25 during an operation outside of Kandahar. We were looking for a high-value target. I don't remember exactly who it was, but it was either a Taliban or Al-Qaeda person of some importance that we were trying to find. Bottom left-hand corner that's actually where when we would leave the perimeter in the airfield in Kandahar, that was the first kind of turn that you would make once you left the dirt road onto Route 1, and there were always people that would sit there and hope that we would throw something off the vehicle to them, whether it was water, candy, or whatever it was, MREs, meals ready to eat. The one picture there, bottom middle, is a picture of our unit when we left Camp Rhino to move up to Route 1 to begin our ambushes against the Taliban along Route 1. It's a great picture. It's probably about the middle of the company, so I think that's my platoon in that picture. Bottom right is General Mattis. He was the Task Force 58 commander. Task Force 58 was the unit, the conventional force that went into Afghanistan after the Special Operations Forces, and also the CIA teams that were operating in Afghanistan right after September 11th. So he commanded the first conventional force that went into Afghanistan. He's the guy that I talked about us picking up just west of Kandahar before we went to take the airfield. He rode in with us. His name is Jim Mattis. He earned the nickname Mad Dog. He's a pretty interesting individual. He's now retired from the Marine Corps, and Marines like to try to entice him to run for president. So there's a whole Vote for Mattis movement on social media. And then middle is a picture of the entire company, Bravo Company, 1st Light Armor Reconnaissance Battalion. I think we took that picture in Pasni, Pakistan, prior to us going into Afghanistan. So that was our pre-Afghanistan invasion picture. This plaque my platoon gave to me when I left 1st LAR in 2002, after we came back home from deployment. That picture, I think we took that picture, I think that was taken in Australia. I'm almost positive. That was a picture that we took before September 11th when we were in Australia training with the Australian Army. That's probably one of my most favorite things that anybody's given me is that plaque. And it's kind of a tradition to get a plaque with a obviously inert 25 millimeter round on the plaque. So, and it says 1st LAR Bravo Company, 2nd Platoon Commander, 1st Lieutenant Mike, quote unquote, Kong Hendrickson, Westpac 2001-2002 to Afghanistan and back, Semper Fi, 2nd Platoon. The reason why I got my nickname, my actual nickname is Donkey Kong. It's kind of a funny story. When I was a young 2nd lieutenant, I went to the Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, California. And unfortunately, we had a big party the night before we graduated. And I made some poor decisions and ended up tossing empty kegs over the back fence at the All Hands Club and got in trouble. So I earned the nickname Donkey Kong. So I don't know if you guys, I don't know if you know the game Donkey Kong or not, but okay, good. Yeah, so that was a game from my youth, that video game that I used to like to play. So, yeah. So that's where that came from.